Item 6, Emergency Powers Act 1936. Chief Minister to move.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations make emergency provision in respect of the local elections that were scheduled to take place on the 23rd of April 2020. Instead, they will take place on the 22nd of April 2021. Those commissioners who would have gone out of office on the 1st of May 2020 will remain in office until the 1st of May 2021 unless they vacate their office earlier. The regulations make a number of necessary consequential amendments to certain statutory documents dealing with local authority districts and Douglas wards. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Provisions Local Elections Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member for Peel and Glen Faber, Mr. Harmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to second reserve my remarks.
Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm going to make a point now that I think I'm going to make a number of times throughout this sitting. This is about the exit strategy. So, my understanding of the way the emergency powers regulations work is the moment the emergency is over, all the regulations fall away and stop working, which is fine for the bits of this Act that have amended the Local Elections Act, because that will stay in force permanently. There are bits, however, of this that don't amend any other Act and just exist entirely within the regulations. So the continuation of tenure of office, for example, that's the clause in here, Regulation 6, that says if you're currently a member of a local authority, you will stay a member of that local authority till the 1st of May. So when this Emergency Powers Act, when the Emergency Powers Proclamation ends, these regulations will end. So what happens to all those members? Suddenly they're halfway between two terms. The law itself says their term expires in April, but now it's maybe Christmas time. Who knows where we're at when this emergency is over? What happens to those people? So I think we just need some clarity on really what government's plan is to get us through this. The emergency period obviously can't carry on until these elections happen next year, so I would expect some information really on what changes are going to be made going forwards to try and sort this out. I've got no problem at all with the regulations as they stand. I think they're definitely the right thing to do, and they're definitely doing them this way to get it done quickly is the right approach, but it's just about how we get out of this back onto a usual business as usual footing at the end of this period. Thank you.
Mrs. Poole-Wilson, Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to rise to say that I have had similar questions in respect of the regulations to the point raised by the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper, as to the duration of various sets of regulations and when they expire, what the consequence will be where they have not amended something else that will still be in effect. I have some questions with the drafters on these points at the moment and how they interact with the underlying primary legislation, which provides that even when regulations end, they are not, the ending of them is not deemed to have affected any previous operation thereof. But I think it would be helpful to have some clarity on exactly what that will mean in each case as to the effect of each regulation. And I wonder if at this stage the Chief Minister would just be kind enough to acknowledge that as these questions are worked out, if it is necessary to amend the regulations to pick up on these points, then amending regulations will be brought. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the honourable members for their answers. If I can go to the honourable member for Council first, Mrs. Poole-Wilson. If I say yes, of course, we will be updating members if changes need to be made. I'm not saying it's a quick fix, but we are doing this in the shortest time that we can possibly do, and if any mistakes or changes need to happen in the future, then we will, of course, we're happy to do that. Coming on to my honourable friend, Mr. Hooper, member for Ramsey, this construction must be wrong because the power conferred is to make any provision that might be made in an Act of Tynwald. The bill is intended to solve the problem, and we will clearly be amending the regulations regularly on this.
Members, I put the motion at item 6. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
No. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 7, Emergency Powers Act. Again, Chief Minister to move.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations make emergency provision in respect of the operation of the island's sea and airports. The regulations permit the Council of Ministers to make directions to suspend all or specific port operations for a specified period. These regulations are necessary to ensure that the health of Isle of Man residents can be protected whilst ensuring that goods which are needed by the island's community and economy can still come into the island. Mr. President, I beg to move that Emergency Provisions Coronavirus Port Operations Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member Mr Harmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Members, I put the motion at item 7. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 8. Again, Chief Minister, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations make emergency provision to modify and disapply certain provisions of the Town and Country Planning Act 1999 and other regulatory legislation during the coronavirus emergency proclamation period. This will allow existing premises to be used for adapted purposes. So, for example, an existing restaurant or cafe which has planning approval for its operation on a dine-in basis could be permitted to offer food and alcohol on a takeaway basis instead. Permission to operate in this way will be through a written consent from the Council of Ministers for a specified purpose. Such a consent may specify a date on which the consent will expire, or if it does specify a date, it will expire automatically 7 days after the coronavirus emergency proclamation period ends. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Planning and Regulatory Legislation Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member for Peel and Glen Faber, Mr Butt.
Mr. President, I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Member Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Again, it's a similar concern here in respect of the exit strategy. So businesses will be spending time, energy, resources, altering their business to work in a different way, in a different model. And the Chief Minister said actually he's not expecting any positives out of this pandemic. I, for one, am expecting one positive. I'm expecting to be able to get food delivered to my house in Ramsey much easier following this pandemic. But the point I'm trying to make is if these businesses want to carry on that business, is there going to be a mechanism for them to be able to do that post-emergency period? Equally, if those businesses have adapted and need to adapt back to their previous way of working, will they be given time to do that? It appears that they'll be given 7 days following these regulations, following the end of the proclamation period, to get back to business as it was before. I'm not sure if that's going to be long enough. I'd just like this to be considered really and thought about. I don't appreciate a solution to be thrown on the table today, but I think as we get through this, when we get into our recovery phase of trying to rebuild the economy, some of these questions are probably ones that need to be floated and considered. Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the honourable member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper, for his comments. And I think we can safely say that for all the measures that we're taking today, it's not going to be set in stone. We may have to make changes as we go along. This is the best we've been able to do in an incredibly short time. And whilst I'm on my feet, if I can pay tribute to the Attorney-General and his team for working day and night for drafting this legislation, for His Excellency the Governor for working day and night to approve these measures under the emergency power, really has been an incredibly big team effort. And of course I will give assurances to the honourable member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper, that going forward, if we see a better way to do it or a tweaking of the situation, then of course we will. Obviously we'll have to come to this honourable court, Mr. President, to make those changes. But I think in comments made by a colleague whose name I forget, maybe things that will be good that come out of this are some of the changes we've been forced to make, as I alluded to in Canterbury, where they had to make significant changes. We may well want to keep those changes, but that decision will be made by this honourable court on a recommendation, obviously, from Council of Ministers. Thank you.
I put the motion at item 8. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. 9. Chief Minister to move.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations give the Department of the Environment, Food and Agriculture a power to make regulations to regulate the supply and distribution of food and fuel during the coronavirus emergency. I hope that people will be sensible in their buying habits and that the island's supply chain with the UK continues to operate smoothly so that it will not be necessary for the Department to make use of these new powers. But it is important for contingency purposes that these powers are available to the Department. Any regulations made by the Department under these regulations must be laid before Tynwald and approved by Tynwald within 7 days of them being made. Mr President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Food and Fuel Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member Mr Burt.
I beg to second and reserve my remarks, Mr President.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Just one question for the Chief Minister on these. The regulations provide the Department for the Environment with the power to make regulations, but Regulation 4.2 says that they may make consequential amendments as the Department of Infrastructure considers necessary. I just want to check that this is actually an example of collaborative working between government departments and not an oversight or a typo. Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I thank the honourable member in this joined-up world that hopefully we're living, and the answer is yes.
Put the motion at item 9. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 10, Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. These regulations establish a moratorium on landlords evicting any of their tenants who are unable to pay their rent for a limited period. The moratorium is for a period of 90 days and it only applies where a tenant does not pay their rent in full or at all. The moratorium does not apply to other circumstances which might lead a landlord to want to evict a tenant, for example, if a tenant has damaged their property. At the end of the moratorium, the landlord must make arrangements with the tenant for the payment of the arrears that have been incurred. In such arrangements, the landlord must make reasonable allowance for the financial circumstances of the tenant in respect of a loss of income by the tenant due to the effects of the coronavirus. Mr President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Protection for Evictions Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member Mr Harmer.
Thank you, Mr President. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Member for Council Mrs Wilson.
Thank you, Mr President. And I rise in relation to these regulations to welcome them very much, but on a theme that's already been raised, some of the challenges around the interaction between the definition of the coronavirus proclamation period and the protected period, and if these regulations go out of operation at the end of the emergency period, what will that mean for provisions that are in there, including the definition of the protection or the prohibition period, and also Regulation 6, which is important around a duty on landlords to make arrangements with their tenants for payments of arrears and to take into account any impact they may have suffered as a result of the coronavirus. So I don't expect that the Chief Minister will necessarily have the answers to these questions, but if it transpires that we do need to make further amendment in order to ensure that provisions like Regulation 6 survive the end of the coronavirus emergency period, then his reassurance again that these will be forthcoming. Thank you, Mr President.
Honourable Member Mr Baker.
Thank you, Mr President. I too very much welcome this protection to occupiers, both personal and corporate and residential and commercial. I'd just like to ask the Chief Minister just to consider, and not for a response now, as to whether we need to go a step further than just protect those individuals and organisations' ability to occupy premises, but maybe even need to give them some protection against creditor pressure during this period of emergency, because clearly there will be businesses and individuals who have substantial financial challenges. They may, with these regulations, be able to stay in occupation, but that doesn't protect themselves from an aggressive creditor or indeed a bank not being as enlightened as we would like them to be, or perhaps even pressure from other less reputable funding providers who may choose to exercise their own personal protection mechanisms, which could indeed force the business or the individual into some form of insolvency or bankruptcy. And I think it's something that needs to be thought about. I'm not looking for a response immediately, but I would appreciate due consideration being given to that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Honourable Member Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, I was going to rise to make actually all of those points that have been made, and I just want to reiterate that these are very welcome regulations, but there are some concerns around them. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, the Regulation 6 that deals with arrangements of payments of arrears. Now, are these arrangements legally binding? So if a landlord enters into an arrangement today, these powers vacate, they stop, whatever happens, can a landlord just renege on those agreements straight up and say, sorry, at the end of the emergency, I've changed my mind? Or equally, can a tenant renege on those agreements and say, sorry, I've changed my mind? I just want to make sure that these things are considered in the round, and that tenants and landlords both have enough protection, not just during this emergency period, but in what is likely to be quite a long recovery phase afterwards.
Honourable Member for Douglas East, Mr Robert Shaw.
Thank you, Mr President. I make no apology for rising and reiterating what previous colleagues have already said, in the sense that in terms of those who have mortgages, there is an understanding that there will be holidays provided which place those payments many years down the road, whereas with those who are renting, the fear that they might have at this stage that suddenly, when this terrible storm has passed, that they suddenly face this debt or an aggressive landlord. We need to signal as soon and as early as we can that we are very mindful that the unwind process has got to be very carefully handled indeed. And I seek the Chief Minister's reassurance on that matter.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I thank all the honourable members who have raised comments, and really I won't answer each one individually because they are all the same comments really. Effectively what the honourable members are saying is that if we come across problems going forward and abuses and reassurance for people, because we don't know how long this is going to last for. It could be 4 months, it could be 12 months. We really do not know, and all I can give to reassure honourable members is that working together we will come up with solutions on how to tackle the issues that they have raised, and further legislation will be required for, I should imagine, virtually everything I am bringing forward today. I am effectively putting a marker down today, Mr President, on what we propose to do. If we need to amend it to make it, improve it, or to catch some of the areas that maybe we haven't had chance in an incredibly short period of time to do, then of course we will. Thank you, Mr President.
Honourable members, I put the motion at item 10. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Now, Chief Minister, you're past the halfway point of your proposals. Item 11.
Thank you, Mr President. I have my usual press conference. Unfortunately, I've put it back half an hour to spend the enjoyable time with you all this afternoon. Mr President, the purpose of the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Enterprise Act Amendments Regulations 2020 is to amend the Enterprise Act 2008 to allow the Department for Enterprise to support a wider range of businesses than would otherwise be the case for the duration of the proclamation of emergency. In particular, the regulations remove the requirement that any financial assistance provided by the Department must be likely to encourage sustainable economic growth in the island. In addition, regulations made under the Act become subject to the negative Tynwald procedure rather than approval. This potentially allows the Department to amend and perhaps simplify the criteria for businesses which are eligible to receive financial support more quickly. These regulations allow the Department to launch the Coronavirus Business Adaptation Scheme. Financial support will be available under the scheme to assist businesses that are seeking to develop new products or adapt their services as a result of the pandemic. Mr President, I now beg to move that the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Enterprise Act Amendment Regulations 2020 be approved.
Honourable Member for Rushden, Mr Skelly, Minister
Good
of Enterprise.
morning, Dr. Brown. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Member Mr Robert Shaw.
Thank you, Mr President. There has been a huge amount of work going on, obviously, in a number of areas, many areas of government, and I commend officers and ministers for the tremendous effort they've put into all this incredibly important work. But I'm brought to my feet on the basis that there has been so much information brought forward so quickly. Can the Chief Minister reassure me that when the dust settles in a few days, perhaps, or a week or so, that it will be possible to consolidate all these schemes and ideas so that different people from different circumstances, be they self-employed, employee, out of work, small businesses, large businesses, can go to a place that tells them what's going on, and if it doesn't actually explain it in that particular website, that it can be it can refer off on a simple click-through, because it is there's a tremendous amount of work being done, and it'll be difficult for a lot of people to be able to understand all the implications of it. Thank you, Mr President.
Honourable Member Mr Skelly.
Good morning, if I may. Mr Robshaw raised a very, very good point and question there. This is actually a key, probably the plank within the department is key legislation that allows us to do much of what we actually do. But this one actually is all about the potential to amend our existing schemes. And one of them we call adaptation schemes. We've already had people saying how do they change their business for this new economy in the recovery period. So what we're doing here is actually laying I think the route map for that adaptation opportunity going forward.
Will the Minister give way?
Will do.
I think I didn't explain myself well enough, obviously, Mr President. Is it possible for all matters relating to businesses and individuals that concerns your department also to sit alongside the tremendous amount of information coming out of Treasury, so there's a go-to place for people to understand all these issues?
Yes, I would definitely say that we do need to do that. However, there are separate pieces of legislation, and that's what we are here this afternoon trying to do, is to move those legislation to be able to react to businesses in different areas, not just businesses, but employees as well at the same time. At this moment in time, we're fielding, from our departmental point of view, somewhere in the region of 600 plus inquiries. That's as of yesterday. We know that's going to grow, and Treasury, I know, have a volume as well. So we do have a landing page already, and if I may, while I'm on my feet, Hector, is highlight that. If people have any questions, either go to our website, and we'll be happy to be that front door first and foremost, and they can actually just send questions to enterprise support@gov.im, because it's quite difficult, as all our staff now pretty much are actually working remotely, so phone calls are really difficult. So we'd suggest an email if they possibly could in the first instance, but please bear with us as we do respond to that.
Mrs Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Mr President. It's a small but significant point in that these regulations do not specify their duration. They simply talk about when they will come into operation, and importantly, the coronavirus proclamation period in these regulations is limited to the initial proclamation, not any subsequent proclamation. So again, just worthwhile getting on the record that it's likely we will need to see further regulations to keep the powers in here available, particularly in light of what the Minister for Enterprise has indicated about being used for adaptation and recovery purposes. Thank you, Mr President.
Mr Hooper. No. Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. And again, if I can take them in reverse order that I was asked of my good friend and colleague, the Member for Council, Mrs Pearl Wilson, I suppose in one word, yes, for the brevity the President looks for from me from time to time. If I can go back to my good friend, neighbour and colleague, Mr Robert Shaw, the Honourable Member for Douglas East. Thank you for that. If I can say, obviously my colleague, the Minister for Enterprise, did stand up and give an answer on the individual sector, but if I can just reassure all honourable members that at this time my team in the Cabinet Office are working flat out. They'll be working all weekend, so that hopefully on Monday or Tuesday of next week we will be able to announce dedicated areas for members of the public, not just to go for the business community, which the honourable member has raised, but social care, general inquiries, etc. Obviously, these infrastructures are being set up, and I do hope to be able to give announcements early next week for a number of areas, not just the business side of things. Thank you, Mr. President.
Put the motion at item 11. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 12, Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations amend the Emergency Powers Potentially Infectious Persons Regulations 2020 in two ways. Regulation 11 of the schedule to the principal regulations, which deals with limits on the requirement to self-isolate, is replaced. This amendment was requested by the Department of Health and Social Care because it considered that the original version did not work as required for healthcare workers. Regulation 11 was therefore redrafted so that the Chief Secretary may now exempt certain persons or classes of persons from the requirement to self-isolate under certain conditions. The Chief Secretary cannot exercise this power without consulting both the Department of Health and Social Care and the Director of Public Health. These regulations also amended Regulation 10 of the schedule to the principal regulations in two ways. Firstly, a restriction on people who are self-isolating leaving their home was relaxed. However, this amendment has been superseded by the greater restrictions that have been brought in since these regulations were made, and this provision is to be revoked. Secondly, the requirement for a self-isolating person to provide information to the Department of Health and Social Care was clarified, and this will be retained. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Potentially Infectious Persons Amendment Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Mr. Crageen.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you. I'd just like Chief Minister, if you could just clarify that final point about the further amendment to the clause that's in these regulations around those who are self-isolating and their ability to exercise, just so there's no confusion. Could the Minister please clarify where we're at today? Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Effective as I see it, emergency powers have been brought in, Mr. President, to make people self-isolate for 14 days. But if a specialist key worker was to come to the island to do a job, then the Chief Secretary, with the support of Health and Social Care and of the Health and Social Care and Public Health, can allow that to be changed so that they can go straight into work if there's a key element. That's what I see this element being for. It gives a way of making exemptions to the current rules that are in place. Have I answered the question clear enough with it?
That's helpful, Chief Minister, but I was looking really for clarity around those who are self-isolating, just so there's no confusion about their ability to go out and exercise, because there was part of your speech indicated that, notwithstanding what's written in the order that we're approving potentially here, that actually it left some doubt as to whether those who are self-isolating can actually go out and exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Honourable Member, Mr. Baker, for that. If I can clarify, and I thank him for the opportunity for me to try and make this as clear as I possibly can. If you have no symptoms of coronavirus, you are allowed to go out to exercise for the time being. I reserve the right to come back to this Honourable Court to take that right away if it is abused, or if the infections do significantly increase on the island, where our medical advice is that we must stop that. This exemption allows people to exercise if, and I think the key words are, if there are no symptoms and they're not self-isolating. So I thank the Honourable Member for being able to give that further clarification on this very important point.
Put the motion at item 12. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. 13, Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations establish a prohibition on Home Affairs staff leaving the island during the current emergency. With the measures that I announced earlier this week, any such staff, firefighters for example, would then potentially be unable to return to the island. And even if they did return to the island, they would be subject to stringent self-isolation requirements. These regulations do not apply to police constables because the Isle of Man Constabulary already has sufficient powers in this area. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Home Affairs Staff Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Home Affairs Minister, Mr. Crageen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Beg to second, reserve my remarks.
Put the motion at item 13. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 14, Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. These regulations provide for the identification of those persons who are providing medical services in diagnosing coronavirus and those who are treating patients suffering from coronavirus. Sorry, I should have said I'll start that again. There's a key word I missed. These regulations provide for the indemnification of those persons who are providing medical services and diagnosing coronavirus and those who are treating patients suffering from coronavirus. The indemnity also covers persons who may providing such services or care in addition to those who would normally provide the services or care. This would cover, for example, retired nurses or doctors who have returned to help the health service at this difficult time. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Health Service Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr. Ashford, Health Minister.
Beg to second to reserve my remarks, Mr. President.
Put the motion at item 14. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
No. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Item 15, Chief Minister.
Thank you. These are the last of my motions today, but I fear, honourable members, I will be back. Mr. President, these regulations provide that during the emergency period, the Department of Health and Social Care can issue a protocol setting out certain circumstances in which medicinal products and appliances can be sold and supplied by a person other than a person who is authorised under the island's medicines legislation. For example, such a protocol might permit medicine prescriptions to be filled by a pharmacy when the pharmacist is not available. Obviously, such safeguards as are possible and appropriate can be included in any protocol that is issued by the Department. Any protocol issued under these regulations must be laid before Tynwald. Mr. President, I beg to move that the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Sale or Supply of Medicinal Products and Appliances Regulations 2020 be approved to continue in operation.
Mr. Ashford.
Beg to second reserve my remarks, Mr. President.
Put item 15 to the court. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
No. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.